And for the talk, we're excited to have Professor Jennifer Mason McAward. She's an assistant professor of law. Her research interests include civil rights, constitutional law, and habeas corpus. She received her undergraduate degree, summa cum laude, from Notre Dame in government with a minor in theology, and she spent 1 year doing volunteer work with the Holy Cross Associates program. She graduated from law school at New York University Law. And after graduation, she clerked for Judge Alex Kozinski on the Ninth Circuit, and then Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. She was a public interest fellow at Holland and Knight, where she worked on civil rights cases, among others. She has a continued dedication to Catholic social thought and civil rights, and we're honored to have her here today. So, thank you.
Thanks for coming. I'm sure that the fact that J.W. Chen's was being presented was also a draw, so well done. I'm also, for those of you who know me, I'm not so good with technology, but I actually did a PowerPoint to go with today's talk, so if it's a disaster, let me just apologize in advance because I'm not so good, but ain't forever. So I wanted to start out talking about Catholic social thought generally, just to acquaint you with what it is, and then tie it into specific aspects of the teaching that pertain to individual rights and specifically to racism and discrimination, and then talk more generally about the Catholic Church and how it responded to slavery and racism and Jim Crow in the 1960s. So Catholic social teaching is the body of church teaching regarding God's special love for the poor and oppressed, and the call to build relationships built on love and justice. And at the core of Catholic social teaching is the truth that each person is created in the image of God and therefore has inherent dignity that we all must respect. Catholic social teaching obviously has its roots in the life and teachings of Jesus, but also in the Hebrew prophets who announced God's special commitment to the poor. A more formalized development of Catholic social doctrine began in 1892 when Pope Leo XIII issued an encyclical entitled Rerum Novarum, which considered the treatment of workers, the poor treatment of workers during the Industrial Revolution, and started thinking more systematically about what the rights of workers should be, the dignity of work, and the need to treat people respectfully. Popes Pius XI and XII also issued social encyclicals, but a real concerted focus on social doctrine started in the 1960s with Vatican II and the encyclicals of now St. John XXIII. Since then, the content of Catholic social teaching has been articulated in papal statements, Vatican conference documents, and also, for our purposes in the United States, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, some of their conference statements. About 10 years ago, now St. John Paul II directed the compilation of a complete overview of the Church's social teaching, and it was published, and it's called the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church. And it's worth looking at if you haven't seen it. It's very thorough and very thoughtful, and really speaks to the Church's teaching on justice, society, and interpersonal relationships. So overall, Catholic social teaching provides a systematic moral framework as well as concrete instruction about how to build a just society and live holy lives amidst the challenges of modern society. And there are 7 main themes in the documents. So here we go. How about that? So there are 7 main themes. The first is the life and dignity of the human person, the call to family, community, and participation, rights and responsibilities to advance the common good, the option for the poor and vulnerable, the dignity of work and the rights of workers, the virtue of solidarity, and care for God's creation. And so since I was asked to focus on racial justice specifically, I thought it would be helpful to delve more deeply into what the Church teaches with respect to rights and responsibilities, and then even delve more deeply into race specifically. So at the core of Catholic social teaching is the principle that all persons are made in the image of God. And a just society can become a reality only when it is based on respect for the transcendent dignity of the human person. And therefore, each person has a set of human rights that are granted to them. And those include civil rights, political rights, and economic rights that include things from the right to life, to bodily integrity, and the means which are suitable for the proper development of life, including food, clothing, shelter, rest, medical care, and necessary social services. And so with that set of rights that we're all endowed with comes a corresponding responsibility that rests on individuals to contribute generously to the establishment of a civic order in which rights and duties are more sincerely and effectively acknowledged and fulfilled. So in addition to individual responsibility, there's a corporate responsibility that adheres in government itself. And so the governmental responsibility, the chief concern of civil authorities must be to ensure that these human rights are acknowledged, respected, and coordinated with other rights, defended and promoted, so that in this way everyone may more easily carry out their duties. For to safeguard the inviolable rights of the human person and to facilitate the fulfillment of each one's duties should be the chief duty of every public authority. And so the docket's encyclical called Peace on Earth, it goes on to say, indeed, for experience has taught us that unless government authorities take suitable action with regard to economic, political, and cultural matters, inequalities between the citizens tend to become more and more widespread. And as a result, human rights are rendered totally ineffective and the fulfillment of duties is compromised. And so there's harm that comes from and wounds the community as a whole and destroys solidarity among persons. Okay, so that's just the church's general
rights, right? We have a broad array of rights available to us as humans made in the image of God, and there are corresponding responsibilities that adhere both in individual citizens and the government writ large to advance those rights and to make sure that there's a community of solidarity. So where has the church stood, and currently where does it stand on civil rights and the problem of racism? It's well established that the institutional Catholic Church, both globally and in the United States, took an embarrassingly long time to acknowledge that slavery was categorically sinful. So while there were a few popes who condemned the enslavement of particular groups of people, so for example, the enslavement of Native Americans in South America, there are other popes in the 15th century who authorized the enslavement of non-Christians. And even more importantly, church teaching as late as 1866 stated that it was not contrary to the divine law for a slave to be sold, bought, or exchanged. That started to change in 1839 when Pope Gregory XVI condemned the slave trade. But the problem was his statement focused only on the slave trade and not the actual holding or enslavement of persons. So it was in 1890 that Pope Leo XIII became the first pope to condemn slavery as a general matter. And then in 1965, Vatican II declared that slavery is an infamy and a supreme dishonor to the Creator. So what was going on in the United States at this point? Well, in the United States, some Catholic clergy were slaveholders, and that included the Archbishop of Baltimore and the Jesuit community in Maryland, held slaves before the Civil War. After 1839, where you had Pope Gregory XVI condemning the slave trade, the Bishop of Charleston, South Carolina, was very concerned about rumors concerning that document, that it was a condemnation of slavery as a whole, and concerned that there were rumors that American Catholics were actually supporting abolition of slavery, which, by the way, they generally were not. So the Bishop of Charleston, South Carolina, wrote extensive letters to the U.S. Secretary of State trying to explain the church's position on slavery and saying, all the Pope meant was slave trade. Holding slaves is fine. It's entirely consistent with the Catholic Church's teaching for people to hold slaves. So please don't construe anything that the Pope said as a challenge to our ingrained structure of chattel slavery here in the United States. So that was the Bishop of Charleston, South Carolina, probably speaking for a pretty large subset of Southern Catholics. There were Catholic bishops who vocally opposed slavery, the most notable of whom was Cincinnati Archbishop John Baptist Purcell.
But even after the abolition of slavery and the Civil War and the advent of Jim Crow in the American South, most Catholic leaders in the United States refused to challenge the morality of state-sponsored racial segregation. So now focusing on Jim Crow and the Civil Rights era, I will get to the good part of the story after I talk about the bad parts. So there certainly were some Catholic heroes during the Civil Rights era, but overall the role of the Catholic Church with respect to civil rights in the 1950s and 60s was spotty at best. So by the time we're getting into the beginning of the Civil Rights era in the late 1930s, within the Vatican, Pope Pius XI was actually in the process of drafting an anti-racism encyclical. He died in 1939, and his successor, Pius XII, refused to release the document. So there was no guidance from the Vatican on the question of racism. On the national level, in the United States, what's now the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops issued clear and repeated pastoral letters stating that racial discrimination and segregation were immoral and inconsistent with human dignity. That started in 1943. But the institutional Catholic Church in the American South did not take anything close to a clear stance on the question, or at least the right side of the stance. So the American South was mostly Protestant at the time. So the Catholic Church itself was a bit of an outsider and was back on its heels. But the average Southern white Catholic held views that were pretty much consistent with Southern black Protestants in terms of their racial views. And most Catholic leaders in the South refused to challenge the morality of state-sanctioned racial segregation. So just to provide some concrete examples of that, in Alabama, many dioceses complied with Jim Crow laws by building separate parishes for African Americans, separate schools, and separate hospitals. Even in dioceses across the South where whites and blacks were permitted to attend the same church, seating and communion lines were segregated, with blacks often sitting behind a screen toward the back of church and being at the back of communion lines. Catholic diocesan schools in Alabama remained segregated until 1964, which is 10 years after Brown versus Board of Education. And even when desegregation began in Alabama Catholic schools, there were so many protests from white Catholic parents that integrated admissions took place only on an individual case-by-case basis, which meant that integration was very, very slow to take place in Catholic schools. Now, Alabama, and particularly Mobile, Alabama, was one of the largest and most important Catholic regions in the South. The auxiliary bishop of Mobile was one of 8 clergy members who signed on to an open letter in 1963 that denounced Martin Luther King Jr. and his organization as destroying the racial harmony of the city. And it was in response to that letter, to which one signatory was the Catholic auxiliary bishop, that Martin Luther King composed his famous letter from a Birmingham jail. So the actual Archbishop of Alabama had forbade priests during Jim Crow to publicly challenge segregation or to participate in demonstrations. And so most priests obeyed him, but there was one notable exception. A guy named Father Albert Foley, who refused to obey this ban on publicly protesting segregation. And Father Foley brokered a deal with the mayor of Mobile, a guy named Joseph Langan, who was Catholic. And so Father Foley brokered this deal to desegregate Mobile's downtown eating establishments. He did that in 1961. After Father Foley brokered this deal, the Archbishop of Alabama sought to have him reassigned out of the diocese for insubordination. So in addition to Father Foley, there were other Catholic leaders and lots of Catholic lay people who took clear stands against segregation. So 35 to 40 Catholic priests, plus an unknown number of nuns, Why didn't they count the number of nuns when they know the number of priests? I don't know. But priests and nuns participated in the Voting Rights March in Selma, Alabama, explicitly against the Archbishop's wishes. And indeed, there's an order of nuns, the Sisters of St. Joseph from Rochester, New York, who sent to the South and established a mission in Selma, where they established a mission church, a parish school, and a hospital that served the African American community. And those nuns, all of whom were white New Yorkers, were threatened by the Klan. The city registrar attempted to block them from voting. They didn't themselves participate in the Selma March, but they supported it behind the scenes by hosting other nuns who did march. And after Bloody Sunday in March of 1965, the Sisters of St. Joseph provided medical assistance to those who had been beaten during the march. So those are some kind of unnamed Catholics who supported civil rights. Notably, there's the Archbishop of New Orleans in the late 1950s, Joseph Rummel, in New Orleans declared the gradual integration of all Catholic schools, churches, and hospitals. So New Orleans was in stark contrast to Alabama, which had a lot of segregation in Catholic schools and Catholic churches generally. There are also some lay Catholic organizations that sprouted up in the mid to late 60s that held integrated masses and petitioned church leaders actively to end the seating segregation at masses. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention probably the most prominent Catholic civil rights crusader, who's Notre Dame's own Father Ted Hesburgh. So for those of you who don't know, Father Ted was the president of Notre Dame from 1952 to 1987. And he was a member and chair of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights from 1957 to 72. So the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights was created by Congress in the 1950s, and its mandate was to investigate race-based deprivations of voting rights and other types of equal protection in the South. And so during the Civil Rights era, it held hearings throughout the South and documented extensive violations in terms of voting rights and other civil rights. Over time, the Commission extended its inquiries to housing, employment, education, public accommodations, and administration of justice. Father Hesburgh served as chair of the Commission later in his tenure, but even when he wasn't the chair, he was one of the committee's most prominent members. And he provided not only intellectual heft, but also savvy leadership within the Commission. And he provided a strong moral voice pertaining to racism. And so the Commission would often issue reports, and Father Hesburgh would often issue concurring statements which focused on the sacred nature and God-given dignity of the human person. And so he used his perch to call for compassion and human solutions to great inequalities and injustices. Father Ted has been called the most powerful, unelected official this nation has ever seen. And here's just one vignette to illustrate how he wielded his power, particularly during his time on the Civil Rights Commission. So the Commission was empowered to investigate voting rights violations, and so the hearing was the Commission was having a hearing in New Orleans in which it collected testimony about a New Orleans scheme in which the white voting registrar struck about 2,000 African Americans from the voting rolls. And to re-register to vote, these African Americans were required to present 2 registered voters who would testify to their voting qualifications. Well, there were no more registered African Americans who could vouch for anybody, and no white citizen would go on record vouching for an African American. So essentially, they were barred from voting. So the Commission heard about this problem from a witness who was African American and a U.S. Army captain who had been disenfranchised. And so, because he was unable to provide the required witnesses, he went to the local registrar and he presented a photo ID, his federal income tax return, his professional credentials in dentistry, and his honorable discharge from the Army. He presented these to the registrar and he was turned away. So he then goes before the Commission on Civil Rights tells them the story, and the hearing was being televised. And Father Hesburgh responded, "Captain, I believe you, and I am sure that everyone who is watching this on television believes you. Go back to that registration place tomorrow morning. If they don't register you, call me immediately and let me know, because I will then call the President of the United States, and I will tell him that one of his Army officers is being prevented from voting in Louisiana. I can promise you that the President will make things so hot for everyone that they will wish they had never heard of you." Well, it turns out that the local voting registrar was watching TV that day, and so when the Army captain went the next day, he was registered to vote, pretty much thanks to Father Ted. So there are lots of Catholic heroes, but institutionally the Catholic Church was, at best, slow to catch on to the evils of racism and Jim Crow and segregation. So as an official matter, the Church's teachings on racism and integration began to change in 1965 when Vatican II declared that any kind of social or cultural discrimination in basic personal rights on the grounds of race, sex, race, color, social conditions, language, or religion must be curbed and eradicated as incompatible with God's design. So now that we have, decades after that, a more comprehensive corpus of Catholic social teaching, we have the Church addressing discrimination on a number of levels. The first is to acknowledge the Church's failure historically to deal with slavery and racism. And so the U.S. Catholic bishops have written, "Each of us as Catholics must acknowledge a share in the mistakes and sins of the past. Many of us have been prisoners of fear and prejudice. We have preached the gospel while closing our eyes to the racism it condemns. We have allowed conformity to social pressures to replace compliance with social justice." So they acknowledged the Church's failure and also began to conceptualize racism as a sin. As I mentioned earlier, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, starting in the 1940s, had issued statements against racism. And they wrote, "Racism is a sin. It's a sin that divides the human family, blots out the image of God among specific members of that family, and violates the fundamental human dignity of those called to be children of the same Father. Racism is the sin that says some human beings are inherently superior and others are essentially inferior because of race. It is the sin that makes racial characteristics the determining factor for the exercise of human rights. It mocks the words of Jesus. And more than that, it's a denial of the truth of the dignity of each human being revealed by the mystery of the Incarnation." So, now that the Church has conceptualized racism as a sin, it also deals with the question of intentional discrimination and condemns it. All should be equal before the law, find equal admittance to economic, cultural, civic, and social life, and benefit from a fair sharing of the nation's riches. But more than that, the Church also acknowledges that there's structural discrimination that exists. The bishops have written, "The structures of our society are subtly racist. For these structures reflect the values which society upholds. They are geared to the success of the majority and the failure of the minority. Members of both groups give unwitting approval by accepting things as they are. Perhaps no single individual is to blame. The sinfulness is often anonymous, but nonetheless real. The sin is social in nature, in that each of us, in varying degrees, is responsible." And then finally, the bishops, this is from Vatican II itself, encourages both education and action against racism. And Vatican II said, "It's now possible to remove from most of the human race the curse of ignorance. A duty most appropriate in our times, especially for Christians, is to work untiringly to the end that fundamental economic and political decisions are taken nationally and internationally, which will ensure the recognition and implementation everywhere of everyone's right to human and civil culture in harmony with personal dignity, without distinction of race, sex, nationality, religion, or social circumstances." Okay, so the Church has come a long way. It had a long way to come. But at least in terms of its official teaching, the church is grappling with not only individual racism, but structural racism and structural sin. And it all goes back to the principle that each person is created in the image of God, and anything that treats another as less than that, particularly racism, will destroy our entire social fabric. So I hope that helps to just flesh out a little bit of what Catholic social teaching is, how it pertains to racism and discrimination, and helps you think a little bit more about our role as individuals, as lawyers, and as participants in civil society, about our responsibilities as citizens and as Christians or as other believers, and what we can do. So with that, I'm happy to open it up to questions or discussion, but I appreciate you taking the time to listen to what I have to say. Yeah.